12,000 years ago, early Europeans lived a hard life in nomadic bands. It was a way of life that had lasted for 100,000 years. Sheltering deep in their caves, they painted images of wild animals they hunted for food. For hundreds of generations, they had followed the herds, depending on them for survival. Now, they're about to face a new challenge. They will confront a different people from a different world. It will change them and all human life forever. The challenge started here on the green hills of the Middle East. Unlike Europe, the climate of the Fertile Crescent produced abundant food all the way from Israel to Iraq. Here, the hunter-gatherers lived very well, and they had learned to hunt with dogs. Dogs have been sitting in the sun with people for at least 12,000 years. They're our oldest companions on the human journey. So close, we're not even sure whether we tamed them or they tamed us. Dogs were a part of life and death. Inside a hut at Ain Malacha in Israel, archaeologists found a woman buried 11,000 years ago under the floor. Beside her head was a puppy. Whoever covered them took the trouble to place the woman's hand over the dog's body.
The Ain Malacha burials and the dogs really signal a shift in that human relationship between what had been a wild species, maybe an adversary, and now which is something that had become part of daily life, and as a matter of fact, even something that merits burial with the dead. And that's a big shift indeed.
The dogs were even more attracted to humans once they built huts.
Dog domestication comes with human sedentism, with people settling down and creating trash heaps and so on that are a lure and an attractant to the dogs. But it does set some sort of a precedent of bringing animals from the wild closer in to that human sphere of life.
The relationship with dogs must have set people thinking. Why not control other animals? It would provide a ready supply of meat and cut down on the hunting. But it took a crisis to push them forwards. The Middle East was hit with over 1,000 years of drought. It was caused by a short ice age called the Younger Dryas, which brought glaciers to Europe and famine to the Fertile Crescent. It was a climate catastrophe. Deep in the sand and suffering, the hunters changed their way of life. Some people escaped to the few oases with water and good soil. Here, they learnt to plant crops and became the world's first farmers. Others searched desperately for game across their traditional hunting lands. But the drought made the animals scarce. To save themselves, they took possession of their prey. The fireplaces of these hunters reveal the bones of goats, which were kept in herds. They were the very first domesticated farm animals. Archaeologist Melinda Zader is tracking the way goats changed as they were domesticated. Her evidence comes from a huge collection of bones gathered from across the entire Middle East. The changes are most obvious in the horns.
You can see on this big guy here from the highlands of Iran, a wild Bezor goat. He's got a very large horn. It's sharply keeled. It's rounded in its sort of profile here. And it goes back in what they call a scimitar shape. And this is very distinctive of the wild goat. It's quite different from what we see in this fellow here, this domestic goat, where the horn is now flattened on the inside, it's twisted, and obviously it's quite a bit smaller. Now the reason for that is that in the wild, this kind of a horn gives the males a competitive advantage in competing for females. In the domestic situation, the males aren't competing for females, but the herder is selecting who breeds with whom. So there's really no need for this large equipment.
Today in the Middle East, people are still herding goats in the same way. The first herders selected smaller and less aggressive animals, removing the very traits the animals needed to survive in the wild. In return, the herders provided food and protection. They soon added other animals to their herds. This one small part of the world supplied almost all our domesticated species. Alongside goats and sheep were pigs. This pottery figure from Turkey is 8,000 years old. Cows were early beasts of burden.
We tend to look at domestication of animals as a big lose-lose situation for the animals. But really, from a Darwinian perspective, it's a big win-win, because domestic animals, through their collaboration with humans, are able to outcompete their wild progenitors. For the humans, obviously, they're obtaining resources, either plant or animal. It may not be as nutritious or even as necessarily as bountiful a diet as they were getting from hunting and gathering, but there is an element of security and predictability that this kind of resource provides.
For the herders, it was a brilliant idea. By keeping the animals alive and breeding them, they guaranteed the supply of meat. The long drought of the Ice Age ended around 11,500 years ago. The world came back to life. Now, something truly remarkable happened. Two distinct ways of surviving, the herders and the cereal farmers, came together. They each had half of the puzzle. The herders had the animals, while the farmers were growing grain to feed the stock. For the first time in history, a ready supply of meat was brought together with cereals. Now the farming way of life was complete. This must have been a challenging meeting. Herding and cultivating were very different ways of life. They both had to adapt. Not all communities took up this new way of life. Some hill villages stayed with grain, but left no evidence of animal herding. By comparing sites, archaeologists can see the remarkable difference animals soon made to farming life. Below the huts, in the valley, was a community which was much larger and more prosperous. The difference here was made by the humble goat. These animals were really the catalyst for urban life as we know it today. People came together in large communities. Extended families could work together. They were now secure and could plan for the future. Reliable grain and regular meat. But there was a downside. People and animals were crammed together. They created hygiene problems and new diseases. The pressure was on to organize, to keep everything apart. To do that, they needed new towns built in a new way. They began to spread down the valleys of Jordan as the population increased.
There's a transformation that's taking place, and you're beginning to get many more settlements than there were before. So quite clearly there's an expanding population, completely reliant on agriculture. They're then moving away from the places which suited them as hunter-gatherers or part hunter-gatherers and settling down in the major areas of plains.
Archaeologists are picking over the ruins stone by stone, tracking the evolution of architecture. The foundations reveal the very earliest building, reconstructed as a simple round house like this. The walls in the original were made from stones dragged from the riverbeds. Beneath these modern desert villages are the very first examples of the building methods still used today. They are separated by 5 meters of rubble and 9,000 years. Here, the builders discovered that the walls of rectangular rooms are stronger than circular ones, so they learnt to make straight walls and corners. 4,000 years before the pyramids, they used stone chisels to shape windows and doorways. Archaeologists have found the place where this surge of creativity actually began, Jerf al-Ahmar in Syria. It's the first complex farming town. Here, they mapped laneways and cramped houses 10,000 years old. Daniel Stodeur's research was a race against time. In 4 years, the waters of a rising dam destroyed the site forever.
In the site of Jerf al-Ahmar, we can have all the architectural evolution of the houses, domestic architecture, with first circular houses, then oval houses with interior rectilinear walls, and finally true real rectangular houses.
The rectangular shapes of Jerf spread. New villages grew with the new ideas. Mohammed Najjar has been excavating a village which shows just how sophisticated these Stone Age architects were. A small plaza led to shaped steps on a central street. Doorways opened to family houses on each side. Najjar found enigmatic tunnels in the walls of the houses, which turned out to be Stone Age air conditioning shafts.
There is a shaft coming through the wall and opening at the floor level, so it's empty from outside. Some of these shafts inside the walls are connected. I'm not sure that you can see it from this side, but we have another shaft here. The opening is here, and because the wall was broken here, in this part, you can see the shaft from here, from the top. At that time, I would say the village was a very beautiful village. I mean, imagine all these houses, one-story houses, two-story houses covered with plaster from the outside and from the inside, and painted red in certain points. I mean, if you can imagine that, that must be a very beautiful village at that time.
These new villages bustled with life. They had plenty of food. Now some people could be freed from the grind of farming. They developed their talents into specialized jobs. Knife makers collected special rose-colored flint for their finest blades. The first potters learnt to make containers from clay, which was dried in the sun. Archaeologists have found the remains of baskets intended for trade. Some were sealed with a lining made with clay or bitumen. Other baskets were woven from local grasses and reeds for a host of different tasks. The same skills were used to develop the first woven fabrics. To do this, they created perhaps the earliest piece of complex technology ever devised. They designed the first looms, still found in villages today. They developed a soft cloth from native flax and made linen. Households grew to take in extended families. Kitchens were separated from bedrooms, and the need for privacy was growing.
The architecture goes way beyond what you need just for simple shelter. People are using architecture, just like modern architects use architecture, to express ideas about not just form and volume and so forth, but about how the world is and how we should live in it and how we relate to that world. They're creating an artificial built environment.
They paid as much attention to the beauty of their domestic objects.
For the first time in human history, we're seeing people who behave like us. They do it because they can. It makes a richer life, it makes a richer world, it makes for deeper understanding. I think we underestimate just homemaking. For us, it's a very deeply felt need, so deeply felt that mostly we don't think about it. But what we're seeing are the very first people who are engaging in that kind of activity where they're in the interior of their house, they're turning it into their little home.
9,000 years ago, they invented the first artificial building material. Smooth, clean, and waterproof, it was instantly popular. Plaster.
I don't think it's entirely utilitarian or functional. It's to do with ideas of home as opposed to just having a house to live in. It's making a place which has all sorts of formal and symbolic values attached to it, just indeed as the houses we live in have all sorts of ways, keys, which tell you how you should behave in this room. Shall we eat in the kitchen? Very informal. Let's have supper in the dining room, and it's quite different.
Plaster was extremely versatile and turns up in many sites. In 1974, Jordanians digging a main road to Amman discovered the Stone Age ruins of Ain Ghazal. Here, Gary Rolifson was able to document on film the story of plaster.
What we're looking at is a Neolithic house with a beautiful plaster floor, with a central hearth for heating and for cooking and for light. The plaster is of excellent quality, very sophisticated.
Ain Ghazal was a large, impressive town with hundreds of houses. Plaster was part of its dazzle.
Every house had to have a lime plaster floor. That's expensive. It's expensive because lime does not exist as a natural resource. Lime has to be manufactured, and it's among the first artificial materials that were ever produced by humans. It comes from burning limestone. And in order to burn limestone, you have to reach high temperatures. The temperatures have to be sustained for long periods of time, and this requires a lot of fuel. Every time that you make a floor at these 50 square meter houses, we figure that you're using at least 6 trees.
In these houses, Rolifson found evidence of a traditional burial. The plaster covered a body with no skull, a ritual developed 3,000 years earlier.
They buried the body beneath the floor and came back sometime later, opened up the burial pit again, and then removed the skull.
Bodies were also ritually exposed to birds of prey outside the town. Then they used building plaster in a new way to preserve images of the dead.
The face was recreated. A portrait was made of the deceased using plaster that was modeled and molded into those particular characteristics that identify grandfather from uncle from aunt. It's an ancestor veneration cult, if you will, that we have a sequence of these people who are being selected in order to establish this connection with the past, this connection with the land, and perhaps then the connection with the house. The Smiths, for example, will be able to trace their genealogy back from this ancestor to this ancestor to this ancestor, all the way back into time. Eventually, you come to this very dim past where even if there's a name out there, you're not really sure what the name means anymore. You get back into this mystical, foggy area of that's so far back in time that you're not really certain how the connections work anymore. These mystical ancestors, we think we've found.
In the laboratory, researchers removed the rubble hiding the statues. After 8,000 years, they revealed life-size figures, just the way they were made. There's a gift for simplicity which takes these figures beyond the portraits of known ancestors.
Instead of being the real ancestors, we think they're the mythical ancestors of the people who lived at Ain Ghazal, if not in the entire region. We see at least 3 pairs of statues that have 2 heads. We already have the symbolism involved of the statues representing mythical ancestors altogether. What we're beginning to see is that we have the Ain Ghazal Smiths and the Jericho Smiths being represented in the same body. So we have 2 parts of the same line coming together symbolically.
These figures are tied into the spiritual life of the early farmers. The evidence for their religion is pieced together from fragments scattered across the region. The origins of the puzzle are found at Jerf al-Akmar. In the middle of the town, Daniel Stoddeur found a completely unexpected building. It was much larger, not a house, but something else. Massive wild cattle horns were found lying where they'd fallen from the wall. Upturned headless humans were carved into a continuous bench. Watching over them were the rearing figures of vultures. This is the earliest known public building. Townspeople could gather together under one roof. After 700 years of use, something terrible happened.
We found a skeleton that was almost complete, but that had no head. No head. The head was taken off. It was the skeleton of a young girl, probably between 15 and 18 years. And this skeleton, this girl, was not buried, just thrown up on the soil.
The girl's hands were twisted in rigor mortis. Within hours of her death, the whole building caught fire, and her body was covered in burning timber. It was a violent end for a mysterious place.
They're not normal houses, they're not meeting rooms for political debate. They're some kind of special building in which some kind of special activities go on. So I think you probably have to think in terms of religious activity, religious belief systems operating at all sorts of different levels.
People were coming together to worship. They left small stone tokens with intricate designs. Their meaning remains unknown.
We found associations of figures, animal figures, and signs. You can see, for example, here that you have a fox, a kind of snake, undulated lines, and here, if I turn it, you have a vulture. These combinations of figures tell a story, a myth, associating death and the vulture, death and the bird of prey. Big birds of prey are taking with them, up in the air, bodies, human bodies without heads.
These images of death occur all across the region. Vultures swoop on bodies, taking off the heads. Centuries later, they spread as far as Göbekli Tepe, 800 kilometers away in Turkey. Archaeologists are slowly digging away an entire hill. They're finding groups of standing stones, twice human height. They're beautifully carved with symbolic figures. The bull, the lion, the snake, and the fox. The archaeologists puzzled over the function of these huge columns. They could not hold up a roof. The heights are different. They now believe these columns are an ancient ritual platform where the dead were exposed to vultures and the bones eaten clean. As the birds of the air ate away the flesh, the spirit could be set free. Here, for the first time, religion became a huge public drama. Its rituals were played out in the open air at a special sanctuary.
There seems to be no settlement. This must be some kind of central ritual place for a number of surrounding communities. And that suggests that communities really are networking, that whatever they're doing in their own community, they're coming together with people from all sorts of other communities to use one central site which they share.
The journey from first farming to a shared religion took 1,000 years. Now, it was time to move on.
Once you've got the whole package, then population's beginning to take a real kick upwards. And then you need more territory. So you're beginning to get groups colonizing new land. Maybe they're having to modify the way they live in order to colonize as they go, but colonizing new land. So you begin to get the spread of agricultural colonists.
Between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago, colonizing farmers spread out from the Middle East through Turkey and into southern Europe. The journeys were pioneered by traders who made sea voyages in small boats. Now the farmers set out with some seeds, a few animals, and the idea of farming. They found a vast continent. They faced the challenge of a new landscape and a new climate. The forest was impenetrable, so they moved up the major rivers.
They're coming in very small numbers into a continent that is already inhabited. So there are lots of people already living there, and it's not as if there was a great frontier of movement and all the natives are being cleared out of the way. These first farmers are really inserting themselves around the much more powerful established communities who are already present. And these Mesolithic natives, the hunters and gatherers whose ancestors had been living there since the Ice Age, were probably there in much greater numbers.
The hunter-gatherers living here never found grains which could be farmed, or the right herd animals to domesticate. The shift to farming just hadn't been possible.
One of the traps we have to avoid, I think, is that we shouldn't think that people back in those times were dumber, not so bright, not so intelligent. So far as we know, they had brains exactly like ours. And if they survived in the conditions in which they lived, they were probably a lot smarter on their feet than most of us are today.
Clan by clan across southern Europe, the native hunter-gatherers were confronted by change. By 7,000 years ago, the travellers were in contact with fishing people at Lepenski Vir in Slovakia. Here, archaeologists can see how the hunter-gatherers and farmers confronted the challenge. They would meet together to trade. The hunter-gatherers offered horn and furs. The farmers brought the necessary animals and seeds to allow the Europeans to develop. They carried the idea of farming. Two ways of life were coming together, transferring knowledge and forming bonds. The explorers pressed on to find good farming land nearby. The families became neighbours. hunter-gatherers would soon become farmers.
When we say farming, let's be very clear what is moving into Europe at this time, because the image of farmers is one that has many contemporary resonances which are really quite irrelevant. These are simple peasants who are using only a basic range of crops. They were settling in small patches of land that were appropriate for growing the crops that they brought with them, and they were constantly adapting to this new environment. But they were also changing it because they were moving into a forested environment, and forests don't allow crops to grow.
To the early farmers, the forest must have been a fearful place. It was easy to get lost. There were bears and wolves. Perhaps the forest had its own spirits. Now the farmers did something that would change the face of Europe forever. They began to systematically clear the forest. They needed to let in the sun.
They start off in Southeast Europe with small axes of the kind that they'd used in the Near East, and as they move into the great forests of Central Europe, you see the technology getting larger so that they can tackle these very large standing forests.
The techniques depended on the forest. Some places could be burnt, but large amounts went down with nothing more than stone axes.
I think you have to think of scattered patches of human occupation, often quite distant one from another, but forming a chain of connections all the way across the continent. So it's not as if a swathe has been cut and clear-felled from coast to coast. It's very much more that individual groups of people have set up their homes in the woodlands and are gradually expanding around these original homesteads.
As these pioneers built their own way of life in Europe, they lost touch with the Middle East. Behind them, in the Fertile Crescent, the old way of life was in crisis. Over 2,000 years, villages had slowly changed the land.
Before villages got established, there was very little human impact on the environment at all. People were moving around. They didn't stay in one place for very long. They didn't have the opportunity to impact the environment. But now, as people are settled in one place, the impacts they do have can build on each other. And they can continue to affect the environment generation after generation after generation.
At Ain Ghazal, Rolofson found evidence of the crisis in the wooden posts that held up their roofs.
The posts that started out at up to 60 centimeters in diameter decrease gradually in size. And we think this reflects the absolute decrease in large trees that are in close proximity to Ain Ghazal itself.
Then the plaster began to suffer, even though they loved it.
It appears to be a mixture of mud and perhaps pounded chalk. I suspect that this represents, again, the lack of available fuel for the use of plaster manufacture. And in fact, in the hearths that the people are using for cooking their food, wood is no longer found. The remains of wood charcoal is no longer found. Instead, they were using animal dung as the fuel.
All the available wood grew on the nearby hills. Slowly, it became harder and harder to reach. Eventually, the supply could not keep up.
There is a deforestation that's radiating out away from the center of the settlement, and wood that should be renewable as a resource. But now we come into this problem with goats. One of the things that goats love are brush and probably the sweetest brush there is a sapling or seedling. And so this is a irreversible deforestation. As long as you keep goats around there, those trees are never going to grow back.
For the first time, human communities were destroyed by environmental collapse, which they themselves had caused.
Population at Ain Ghazal dropped, it plummeted from what may have been its height at 3,000, perhaps even more, down to several hundred people.
Towns like Ain Ghazal were finally abandoned. The archaeological record almost disappears after 2,500 years of settlement. Many of the survivors were forced to become nomadic herders ranging across the exposed highlands. It would take another 1,000 years before farmers found a way to survive in this landscape again. In Europe, the advancing farmers were still trying to use methods from the Middle East. But this world was very different.
A lot of the technologies needed to be rethought. You needed to work out ways of constructing houses purely out of timber instead of out of the mud that you'd used previously. You needed to work out ways of dealing with dense forest.
As they moved north, they moved into a European climate. The seasons were much more extreme. Here, farming seemed to be impossible. For 1,000 years, they had no answer to winter. They could go no further. Finally, they succeeded, breaking through with a complete rethink of their farming methods. They realized that timing was critical and worked out exactly when to plant, how to grow and harvest before the winter. They learned how to use poorer soils.
So now farming is spreading to a whole range of soils which are not so productive, and therefore you need to clear more and more and more of the woodland in order to get the same sorts of yield from these poorer soils. And so the plough arrives as the solution to a problem.
With a plough, the farmers could cultivate much larger areas. It dug deeper to turn over these heavy northern soils. It was a new and uniquely European farming lifestyle, and it spread with amazing speed.
I think one of the reasons why it seems to spread so rapidly, it is astonishingly fast, it's like dropping a match in a pile of dry hay, and the dry hay is the problem, the fact that the farmers are having to cultivate more and more land with their own efforts.
They changed so much, they created a new way of life. Archaeologists call them the Longhouse people. They lived together with their animals in these huge communal buildings. Massive forest timbers, whole trees, held up the roof. Their possessions revealed a new kind of conformity. They all used one kind of axe. They had one style of pottery incised with lines. Perhaps it was the only way for Stone Age farmers to absorb so much change and finally adapt to a new landscape. It was these longhouse people who perfected the use of the most European of farm animals, the dairy cow. In only 300 years, farmers had spread east to Russia and west to northern France. The continent was dotted with cleared fields. The face of Europe had changed forever. As they moved further north, the farmers found new groups of hunter-gatherers. They had plenty of food in a hard climate, where the farmers struggled. These northern people had studied their world for 5,000 years. They left little behind but their graves. In Denmark, at Vedbæk, is a cemetery with 25 bodies. They lie on the antlers of deer. This woman died in childbirth. Beside her, with a piece of flint, the baby lies on a swan's wing. These people show no influence from the Middle East. They retain their own hunter-gatherer culture. The dead lie as they have been allowed to decay. Their skulls remain with the things they loved in life. These hunter-gatherers were able to coexist with the farmers. They were useful to each other.
It seems that farmers and the last hunter-gatherers probably lived side by side for much longer than we previously thought, and all sorts of relationships must have developed between them. But as the farmers became predominant, so the remnant hunters must have melted away to join the farming populations. That was where the excitement was.
But the hunter-gatherers were creative and curious people. They too could work out how to adapt farming to their particular landscape. There's very little evidence that these two cultures clashed violently. Mostly, they taught each other.
Europe wasn't that full. There were plenty of opportunities for people to find land to farm. It was that the advantage slowly went from being a hunter and gatherer up in the hills to being down on the plain with the rest of the farmers, exchanging things with them, interacting with them, and enjoying the excitement of human contact and being part of a larger group.
Ultimately, the decision was about food. The hunter-gatherers abandoned a life with the fear of hungry times for the secure harvests of settled farming. In fusing, farmer and hunter created the culture which started our Western way of life. With their new energy, they achieved something extraordinary together. They built the great monuments of standing stone. Their meditation into the mysteries of life and death, land and spirit. But this too would pass. Another wind of change was coming from the Middle East.